right, welcome to part 3 of module 4, talking about Nixon and the 1970s. We're going to pick up here and continue our discussion of all of the things that are going wrong in the 1970s. We just finished up talking about Vietnam and the disaster that turned out to be, and during the 1970s, it's not going to get any better for the American people. Note that you have 2 identifications for this lecture marked here for you. Now we're going to start by talking about Nixon himself. Nixon is going to run for election in 1968 as the quote-unquote voice of the silent majority. His platform is the idea that all of these voices throughout the 1960s have been really loud, and we've had to listen to all of them, but that the majority of the American people are not counterculture activists fighting for environmental rights and gay rights, that they're still the same people that they've always been, the traditionalists from the 1950s, but that the activists are so loud that they're drowning out the voice of the silent majority. And this turned out to be a very effective way for him to run his campaign. Now, Richard Nixon lost the presidential race to Kennedy in 1960, and Richard Nixon isn't the kind of guy who takes loss very well. He was very disappointed by that. He just didn't do well on TV. He wasn't a naturally likable person. He's very intense. And look at his face right here. He looks like he's very angry. That's just his face pretty much all the time. He had this really awkward way of coming out and greeting crowds with both of his arms up like this, throwing peace signs as an attempt to seem very hip and very cool. He was just a bit of an odd bird. To give you an idea of Nixon's personality, I always like to tell this little anecdote from his personal life. When he was younger, he met this woman, and he liked her a lot, and he asked her to see him, to go out on a date with him, and she said, thank you, I really appreciate the offer, but no, I'm not interested. And he said, okay, no problem. And then the next time he saw her, he asked her out again, and she said, no, thank you, I don't think I'm interested in that, but I appreciate it. And so he said, okay, and then the next time he saw her, he asked her out again. And she said, no, but thank you, I don't think so. And he asked her out again, and he asked her out again, and he asked her out again, and she continued to say no throughout this. But Richard Nixon was not the kind of man to be deterred, and so one day he showed up outside of her workplace. If you're getting a red flag situation here, that's appropriate. And he showed up outside her workplace in his car, and he waited for her to get off of work. And when she came out and she saw him, he said, well, I'm here, why don't I give you a ride home? And she said, I really don't think so. That's weird. And he said, okay. And the next day he showed up, and he said, why don't I give you a ride home? I'm here anyway. And so he continued this. He continued to show up where she was, and he continued to pursue her, and he continued to ask her out until the woman finally said, all right, fine, I will go on a date with you. And that is how we got Mrs. Nixon. She ended up marrying him, and I won't speak as to the happiness of our marriage because I don't know for sure, but ladies or men, if a person is pursuing you that way, it's weird. Do not go out with them unless they're going to become the president of the United States, and then consider it, perhaps. So Nixon had this kind of personality that was just very aggressive and persistent. He hated to lose. He spent most of his life thinking that the whole world was out to get him, and every loss that he ever experienced was because people were just biased against him. So all of that to say, he doesn't take it well when he loses to Kennedy in 1960, and then he goes back to California and runs for governor of California instead, and he loses that in 1962. Not a great start to his 1960s decade, but he is persistent, and so he manages to win the Republican nomination for president in 1968, runs on that platform of being the voice of the silent majority, and he will win by a narrow margin in 1968, largely because we can assume, largely because by that point people are starting to wonder if they haven't made a horrible mistake by allowing the 1960s to become this sort of free-for-all of counterculture. And they're ready for a little bit of balance in the country again. Now, Richard Nixon, he doesn't like the fact that he won by a narrow margin. He wanted to win in a landslide victory. And so the moment that he gets into office in 1968, he begins to plan for the 1972 election. And he's obsessed with the number of people who vote for him. He feels like he didn't win by a big enough margin. And so he will adopt this policy of centrism, which is where he walks a very fine line throughout his first few years, passing policies, some of which appeal to liberals, some of which appeal to conservatives, but not alienating either side, because what he wants is a landslide victory in 1972. So he does pass some important legislation, but he doesn't really take a stand for one side or the other. One of the things that we absolutely have to give Nixon credit for is this policy of détente. Now, he's not always going to get credit for this because some people view it as weak, especially toward the end of the 1970s. But what détente meant was a lessening of tensions, and that's in the context of the Cold War. Nixon took very specific steps to ease the tensions that the United States felt with both the Soviet Union and China. If you remember, when China became communist in 1949, we basically started giving them the silent treatment. We pretended they didn't exist for X number of years, and it will not be until Nixon that we resume our trade and diplomatic relationship with China. And so he is able to go over there and visit them. He opens up negotiations with the Soviet Union to try to reduce the arms race. He makes a lot of strides in that effort. However, he's going to shoot himself in the foot, essentially because he is paranoid. Now, he does get his landslide victory in 1972. He's very happy about that. But some of his tactics during the 1972 election were a little bit suspicious. For instance, it becomes public knowledge that in June of 1972, 5 Nixon associates broke into the Democratic Party headquarters, which were in a building, a hotel called Watergate. That's where we get the name from. That was the name of the building that they broke into. And they tapped the Democratic Party's phones, and they looked at their files, and they did a lot of stuff that they really weren't supposed to do. And they got caught. They were not very good at it. And the police are called, they catch him in the act, and what this investigation that ensues reveals is that throughout the Nixon administration, and particularly during the election, there is a pattern of wiretapping, break-ins, sabotage, and recorded conversations taking place under Nixon's direction. Now, this may not seem like a big deal to you because our political world today is so vastly different from the political world of the time, but this is really the first time that we've had a president accused of what would at that time have been very serious crimes, and it rocks the nation. We've already not trusting the government because of Vietnam and the lies the government have been telling us, and now this supposed voice of the silent majority has been spying on people, and we haven't become accustomed to the idea of the government spying on us yet, and so it's very shocking. Now, at first, these 5 Nixon associates, they don't turn him in. They say that he didn't have anything to do with it, but Nixon was paranoid, and he had recorded all of his conversations that he had in the Oval Office on what became known as the secret tapes. And those tapes revealed that Nixon had been behind the whole thing, that he had given the orders, that he hated the media, that he didn't like how he was being portrayed, that he had all of these problems, and that he believed that it was within his right to manipulate the Democratic Party in order to win in 1972. So once they have those tapes with Nixon's own voice recorded by Nixon, clearly connecting him to the crime, it becomes clear that he's going to be impeached. And so instead of going through that whole process, he will resign in 1974, becoming the only president in our history thus far to resign the office of the president. And the impact of Watergate is going to be significant on the country. We're going to lose faith in our government, and it's also going to expose a lot of other problems. There's a series of hearings called the church hearings that come as a result of Watergate, and what those hearings reveal is widespread Cold War political abuse. It reveals that the FBI has been spying on millions of Americans to attempt to identify their communist ties. It reveals that the FBI tried to stop the civil rights movement because it was embarrassing to the country as a whole. It reveals rampant CIA activity, as we have repeatedly um, overthrown governments in other countries and installed pro-American governments. And so as a result of these hearings, we will try to put restrictions on the FBI and the CIA to better regulate them. But it's too little too late, essentially, because the church hearings on top of Watergate destroy America's faith in its government and leaves us kind of the shell of the country that we were for a little while. One of the interesting things about Watergate is that it actually undermines liberalism. Liberalism is based on the idea of having a strong and active, socially conscious government. And when you don't trust your government, the last thing that you want is a stronger government. And so, although Nixon was a conservative with the Conservative Party, the Republicans, his shame, his removal from office will not promote liberalism as an alternative, but will actually continue to promote conservatism as people call for a lessening of power in the government. And so this is going to lead to a trend of the rise of conservatism in the mid-1970s. Now, as a whole, the 1970s is not a fun time for the United States. So we're in the Vietnam War, we've got all these radical individual movements, we've got no faith in our government, our president has just resigned shamefully, and on top of all of that, we're not making any money, which always takes its toll on the American psyche. We enter into an economic downturn in the 1970s. We're at a trade deficit in 1971, which means that we are buying more products from other countries than we are selling to other countries, which common sense tells you is not a great way to run an economy. The war in Vietnam has cost us $100 billion, which takes its toll. And on top of that, we're entering a time of stagflation. Stagflation is a word that is a combination of two other words, stagnation and inflation. And what that means is it's a combination of stagnant economic growth, where people aren't making more money, no new jobs are being created, the economy's just not doing that well. But we also have high inflation at the same time, meaning that everything costs more. And this is going to put a financial burden on the American people. To make financial matters worse, we enter into an oil crisis in 1973 as a result of a war between Israel, Egypt, and Syria, which causes the suspension of oil to the United States for months. We can't access oil. We get most of our oil from the Middle East, and yet now we're cut off from them. And so this quadruples the price of oil. This would be as though you woke up tomorrow, went to fill your car with gas, and realized that gas was over $10 a gallon. That would be budget breaking for most people, and that's the experience that Americans were having in the 1970s. And that was when they could even get gas at all. A lot of times gas stations would just completely run out of gas altogether, and they wouldn't be, even if they could afford to buy it, they wouldn't be able to access it. And so this causes financial hardship. It also causes embarrassment and political strain because we, as the United States, believe that we should be able to dominate Israel, Egypt, and Syria. These are three small and, in our American mindsets, insignificant countries that we should be able to snap our fingers and give orders to because we're one of the superpowers in the world. And the fact that we can't, the fact that we are unable to just say, yes, you will give us oil, or we will be America and come over there and show you why you made a mistake, because we can't say that, we can't work our way around it, we begin to worry that we've lost our standing in the world, that we're losing the Cold War, that nobody's taking us seriously anymore because of all of these issues that are developing in our country. Part of our instability or insecurity comes from the fact that we don't really have strong political leaders in the 1970s. After Nixon was shamed out of office, Gerald Ford, his vice president, will take over from 1974 to 1976. He's president for about 18 months. That's really all I have to say about Gerald Ford because he's not a very significant president. He doesn't do very much. He's not really presidential material. Fun trivia fact about Gerald Ford is that he is the only president to be a former underwear model, which is a legacy that any president would want. One of his policies is pictured right here, the WIN program. It says, "Dear President Ford, I enlist as an inflation fighter and energy saver for the duration. I will do the very best I can for America." He would send that out to people. His administration would send it out. People were supposed to sign with their address and send it back to him as their commitment to try to fight the economic problems in the United States. And that is not how you make significant change. And so Gerald Ford is kind of a non-entity. He does nothing to make Americans feel any more secure. So then we get Jimmy Carter in 1977. That's this guy here. He's a governor from Georgia, and he's the first person to run on this idea of being an outsider. This is very effective given how people are feeling about Washington politicians at the moment. He says, look, I've been here in Georgia. I haven't been a part of any of this. Georgia's running fine. I'm a religious man. I'll never lie to you. And people love that, and they flock towards Jimmy Carter. They vote for him. They support him. And he's elected with the potential to become really popular. But he's in a very difficult situation because the way that you fix an economy is a very painful process for most people. Economically speaking, the best way to combat inflation, which is taking over in the 1970s, is to increase interest rates and deregulate business. Now, the deregulation of business thing goes over relatively fine, but the high interest rates are going to make people very frustrated, largely because, well, partly because they don't understand why it's happening. If you were to buy a house today and you have reasonably good credit, you would probably get away with somewhere between 4 to 6% interest on your loan. That's pretty good. If you bought a house during the Jimmy Carter era, you were going to be paying 20 to 25% interest on that loan. And people obviously hate that. They can't get loans. They can't get access to money. Now, the reason that he does this, his administration does this, is because that's the best way to draw money out of the economy, which combats inflation, which sets everything right again. It's all of that economic stuff. That's not really the point of this class. But it's a painful process. People don't like it, and people blame Jimmy Carter, even though it is the right thing to do at the time. He also upset people with how he viewed the Cold War. He decided that we were going to switch up our allies. We were going to be allies with people who treated, or governments who treated their people well, and we would not be allies with people who treated their government poorly, which seems like a good idea. But it meant that we had to abandon a lot of our allies in the Cold War because they weren't running regimes that were kind to the people who lived within their countries. And so we lose a lot of allies, and the American people are concerned that it only continues to make us look weak. He gives the Panama Canal back to Panama, and people don't understand why he's just giving American territory away. They think it's another example of his weakness. He will deliver speeches to the American people claiming that the problems in the United States are all a result of the American people's crisis of confidence, and basically blaming Americans. You don't have enough confidence in your country, and that's why we're in this situation. And they get mad about that because they think that he should accept responsibility for the fact that the government still isn't doing that well under Jimmy Carter. But probably the nail in Jimmy Carter's coffin was an event called the Iran hostage crisis, which occurs in 1979. And to understand why we are in this situation, we've got to back up very briefly to 1953. In 1953, the American CIA overthrew the Iranian government because they were not pro-America. Okay, so Iran had democratically elected its own leader, but that person was not pro-United States. And so we sent CIA operatives over there to overthrow that government and install a pro-United States dictator called the Shah. And he retains power in Iran and leads a reign of terror for many, many decades. And the Iranian people are upset about this. And in 1977, Carter will kind of add insult to injury because he will travel to Iran specifically to celebrate the Shah. Now, if you're thinking, well, I thought we could only be friends with people who treated their people well. Yes, that's true. And Carter, like all people, did not follow through on his policies of his idealistic policies completely consistently. And so this is very frustrating to the Iranians. Now, in Iran in 1979, a man named Ayatollah Khomeini will gather a group of followers who will overthrow the Shah and take power. And they will kick the Shah out of the country altogether, and Carter will invite the Shah to come and live in the United States and be protected here. Now, this is very concerning to Ayatollah Khomeini and the new leadership in Iran because they know that the United States has overthrown their government and installed this man in power once already. And now he's living in America, and they wonder, is the United States planning to do this same exact thing all over again? And so they decide to prove to the United States that that would be a very bad idea. And so what they do is in 1979, Khomeini's followers will invade the American embassy in Iran and take 53 hostages. They will keep those hostages for well over a year, refusing to negotiate with Carter for their release. And this is going to be hugely embarrassing to the United States and devastating to the American people to know that 53 American citizens are imprisoned in Iran under the regime, or under a regime that hates the United States. It causes a lot of concern, it causes a lot of insecurity, and it's an embarrassment to Carter, who is unable to retrieve them. Carter will attempt a military operation to free these men, and that operation will go so badly that they won't even get anywhere close to the place where these men are being held before our machinery starts to malfunction, our strategy fails, and it ends in a disaster. And so for over a year, this will be an embarrassment and a source of contention for the United States, and it will essentially destroy Carter's presidency. The day that Ronald Reagan takes office, Ayatollah Khomeini will release the prisoners as Reagan is giving his acceptance speech, and it is generally assumed that this was they were making a point to Carter because he had traveled to celebrate the Shah, because he'd given the Shah shelter, that they were saying essentially, not on your watch. But the moment that Carter left office, the hostages were released, and Reagan will get credit for that, even though it wasn't necessarily about him. But we're going to talk about Reagan next. So this is an example or an explanation of why the 1970s was a really difficult era for the United States, and it will lead to Americans wanting something different, wanting something more conservative, wanting to the age before the 1960s destroyed everything. And so that is what will lead to Reagan's election and presidency, and we'll pick up there when you're ready.